The morning sun filtered through the windows of the small community music center, lighting up rows of shiny pianos that waited quietly for their students. It was Saturday, the day adults came to learn music, some for the first time in their lives. The air smelled faintly of old wood, coffee, and a bit of nervous excitement. Among the dozen learners who entered the classroom, there was one woman who seemed easy to miss if you didn't look closely. She was dressed in simple clothes, the kind that spoke of comfort rather than style. Her hair was neatly tied back and she carried a small notebook tucked under her arm. She always arrived early, always smiled politely, and always sat in the last row. Her name was Lena. Lena didn't talk much. When the teacher, a cheerful man in his 40s, greeted the class with his usual warmth, she simply nodded and returned his smile. She listened carefully to every instruction, writing down small notes in her book, though half the time her hand stayed folded quietly in her lap. The other students noticed her but didn't know much about her. Some thought she was just a homemaker trying to learn something new in her spare time. Others guessed she might have a dream of playing lullabies for her grandchildren someday. Whatever they thought, they saw her as gentle, quiet, and perhaps a little shy. When the teacher asked students to introduce themselves, most spoke with enthusiasm about their goals. One man said he wanted to learn to play for his church choir. A younger woman said she loved pop songs and hoped to impress her friends. When it was Lena's turn, she hesitated for a moment before speaking softly. "I've always loved music," she said, "but I never really had time to learn properly. I just want to know what it feels like to make music with my own hands." The teacher nodded kindly. "That's a beautiful reason," he said. "Music doesn't need a reason, but it's always nice when it has one." The class laughed lightly. In the first few weeks, Lena did what every beginner did. She practiced scales slowly, one note at a time, sometimes pressing a wrong key, then apologizing quietly even though no one had asked her to. Her teacher would walk over, encouraging her to keep going. "Don't worry," he'd say with a kind tone. "Everyone starts this way." She would smile and say, "I'll try again." But there was something about her touch, even during those early lessons, that didn't quite fit the beginner label. Her fingers moved with surprising steadiness, as though they had muscle memory buried deep inside. The teacher noticed but brushed it off. Maybe she was just naturally gifted, he thought. Some people pick things up faster. Still, he often reminded her to relax her wrists, to curve her fingers more, to count aloud. Each time she nodded, following his instructions patiently. She never corrected him, never showed frustration, and never gave any sign that she knew more than she let on. Weeks passed, and the class began to grow closer. The students joked, shared snacks during breaks, and played simple duets together. Lena always participated quietly, clapping for others, praising their efforts, and offering warm smiles when someone got nervous. She never talked much about herself. When asked what she did outside class, she simply said, "I keep busy at home." What no one knew was that at home, she didn't just keep busy. In the evenings, when her chores were done and the world was asleep, she would sit by her old keyboard and a cheap plastic one she'd bought secondhand years ago and play softly in the dark. Her fingers would move over the keys like they remembered something long forgotten. The music was her secret comfort, something she carried quietly inside her like an old flame she didn't want to let burn out completely. Back in class, the lessons continued. One day, the teacher announced, "Next month we'll have a little challenge. Each of you will try to play a piece that's slightly above your level. It's not a competition, just a fun way to see how far you've come." The students clapped excitedly. Some looked nervous. Lena simply smiled. A week later, the teacher introduced the piece, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Even the name carried a weight of mystery. The room buzzed with surprise. One of the students exclaimed, "Isn't that too hard for us?" The teacher laughed. "Yes, the full piece is difficult, but we'll only try the first movement. It's slower and more emotional. Think of it as a chance to connect with the feeling behind the music." Lena listened quietly. Her heart gave a small, almost painful thump. She knew that piece. She knew it by heart. It was the same piece she used to play years ago, late at night on a grand piano under stage lights when applause had once filled her ears. But that was another life, a life she no longer spoke about. She looked down at her hands. They were not as graceful as before. Time had left small marks, lines, a few spots, a little stiffness. But the music, she realized, had never really left her. When the class ended, the teacher came over to her desk. "Lena," he said kindly, "this might be a bit advanced, but I think you can give it a try. Don't worry if it feels too hard. Just take it slow. Even learning a few measures is an achievement," she smiled. "I'll try my best," she replied, her voice calm but her eyes carrying something he couldn't quite read. That night, when she returned home, she made herself a cup of tea and sat beside her small keyboard. The keys were slightly uneven and the sound was thin compared to a real piano, but she didn't care. She closed her eyes and began to play. The notes flowed like old memories returning after a long sleep. She made no effort to simplify or slow down. Her fingers moved naturally, the melody wrapping around her like an old friend's embrace. For a moment, she wasn't a quiet woman in a small town. She was the person she had once been, a musician who could make a room fall silent with her music. When she stopped, tears had gathered in her eyes. She wiped them away gently, whispering to herself, "It's been a long time." In the following weeks, the other students practiced hard. Some complained about how their fingers couldn't stretch enough. Others joked that Beethoven must have had too many hands. During these moments, Lena stayed quiet, helping whoever asked, offering small tips in her gentle way. "Try to feel the rhythm more than count it," she'd suggest softly to one classmate. "Close your eyes for a second. It helps." Her advice always seemed to work, but no one thought much of it. They just assumed she had good intuition. When the practice day came, the classroom buzzed with excitement. The teacher decided they would each play in front of everyone, just a short piece to share their progress. "Remember," he said with a laugh, "this is not a concert. It's about enjoying music." One by one, the students took turns. Some stumbled, others forgot a few notes, but everyone clapped for each performance. When it was finally Lena's turn, the teacher smiled kindly. "All right, let's see how our quiet student does." "Remember, no pressure." Lena stood up slowly. She walked to the piano, sat down, and adjusted the bench. For a moment, she just looked at the keys. The room grew still. Her hands hovered over them, and even before she played, there was something graceful in the way she sat. Calm, centered, completely at home. She pressed the first key. The sound was soft, but full. Then came the next and the next. The melody unfolded like a whisper carried by moonlight. Every note blended perfectly into the next, rising and falling in a rhythm that felt alive. The teacher froze mid-sentence. The students stopped shifting in their seats. They were listening, not just hearing, but truly listening. Her hands moved with confidence, not force. Her touch was tender, as if she was speaking to the piano in a language only they both understood. The music filled the room, wrapping everyone in a silence that felt sacred. When the final note faded, no one clapped immediately. It was as if they needed a moment to return to reality. Then slowly the applause began. Hesitant at first, then stronger, filling the space that moments ago had belonged to her music. Lena stood up, smiling shyly, almost embarrassed. The teacher looked stunned. "That was beautiful," he managed to say. "How long have you been practicing this?" She lowered her gaze. "A little while," she replied softly. The class began to murmur in surprise, trying to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. The teacher exchanged glances with his assistant, both amazed and puzzled. How could a quiet woman who joined as a beginner play with such mastery, such emotion? Lena gathered her notebook, thanked everyone politely, and walked out of the room before anyone could ask more questions. Outside, the air was cool and gentle. She took a deep breath, feeling a calm she hadn't known in years. For the first time in a long while, she realized something, no matter how much she'd tried to hide it. The music inside her was still alive. As she walked home under the soft evening sky, her footsteps fell in rhythm with a tune she hummed quietly to herself, a tune that had once made her known to strangers, and now perhaps would make her known again. The following week, the atmosphere in the music classroom felt different. People talked more softly, their eyes sometimes drifting toward the quiet woman who now sat as usual in the back row. Lena didn't notice, or maybe she pretended not to. She just smiled, opened her small notebook, and listened to the teacher begin the new lesson. The teacher, however, couldn't quite focus the same way. Every time he looked at her, the sound of her playing from the last class echoed in his mind. He had been teaching piano for more than 15 years, and he knew talent when he heard it. But what he had heard that day wasn't just talent. It was mastery, the kind that came from years of deep understanding and emotion. He had told himself he must be overthinking it. Maybe it was just luck. Maybe she had practiced that piece more than he realized. Still, something about the way she moved her hands, so natural, so effortless, stayed with him. When class ended, he waited for her as she packed her things. "Lena," he said softly, "you played beautifully last time. I've been meaning to ask, have you ever played before joining this class?" She paused, her hand resting on the edge of the piano. Then she smiled gently. "A long time ago," she said. He waited for her to say more, but she didn't. She simply gave a polite nod and walked toward the door. It wasn't rudeness. It was just her way. Calm, quiet, keeping her world close to her chest. Over the next few days, the students began to whisper among themselves. "She must have learned before," one said. "No beginner plays like that." Another added, "Maybe she was a music teacher." They weren't being unkind, just curious. But Lena didn't join their chatter. She helped others when asked, clapped when someone finished, and laughed quietly when the teacher made a joke. Her life outside the classroom remained just as simple. She lived alone in a small apartment above a bakery. Every morning she woke early, made herself tea, and went out to help an elderly neighbor with errands. In the afternoon, she spent time reading or visiting the local market. And in the evenings, when the world grew quiet, she played her little keyboard again. One night, while playing, she caught herself remembering something she hadn't thought about in years. A concert hall filled with people, the glow of stage lights, the feel of the polished ivory keys beneath her fingers. She remembered applause that had felt like thunder, and the way her heart had raced with joy. For a moment, she stopped playing. She closed her eyes and whispered, "That was another life." But deep inside, a part of her still missed that life. The music had never stopped calling her. It had just grown quiet while she tried to live differently. The next Saturday, when she arrived at class, the teacher had a new announcement. "I have some exciting news," he said with a smile. "Next month, our music center will hold its first recital. It's not a competition, but a small concert where students can perform what they've learned. Friends and family are welcome." The students cheered and clapped. Some looked nervous, others excited. "I'll be calling each of you this week to confirm your pieces," he continued. "It's completely optional, but I think it's a wonderful experience to share your progress." Lena sat quietly, her hands folded on her lap. The thought of performing again, even in a small setting, sent a flutter through her chest. She hadn't stood in front of an audience in years. The idea both frightened and comforted her. Later that day, when the teacher spoke to each student individually, he came to her last. "Would you like to take part?" he asked gently. She hesitated. "I'm not sure," she said honestly. "It's been a long time since I played for others," he smiled. "There's no pressure. But if you ever decide to, I know everyone would love to hear you again." That night, Lena couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, watching the streetlights flicker outside. The memory of the classroom applause still lingered in her heart. She didn't crave attention or praise, but she missed the feeling of expressing herself through music, of letting people feel something real. She whispered to herself, maybe just one more time. The following week, she told the teacher she would join. His eyes lit up. "That's wonderful," he said. "Do you have a piece in mind?" She smiled softly. "Maybe something simple." "Simple?" He laughed. "I'm not sure you know what that means, Lena." She just laughed quietly, and they both moved on. As the recital date approached, the classroom grew lively. Students practiced during breaks, some stayed late, and the sound of piano notes filled the air from morning till evening. The teacher often walked around, correcting posture, suggesting finger movements, and offering encouragement. But when Lena played, he rarely said anything. He didn't need to. She already knew what each note required, how each pause should breathe. One afternoon, a few students gathered around her piano during practice time. "Can you show us that part again?" one of them asked. "The way you played it last week, it sounded like magic." Lena smiled kindly and agreed. She played slowly, explaining each note, showing them how to let their hands relax. She didn't act superior or proud. Instead, her patience made everyone feel comfortable. The others soon realized that her kindness was just as deep as her talent. When she finished, one of the younger students said, "You should be the one teaching us." The group laughed, but Lena just smiled and said softly, "We're all still learning." At home, she began to practice seriously, not for competition, not to prove anything, but to find herself again through the music she had once loved so much. The small room filled with melody each night. Sometimes she'd stop mid-song and close her eyes, letting the memories come and go. They didn't hurt as much as before. They just felt like gentle reminders of who she was. A few days before the recital, the teacher stopped her after class. "Lena," he said, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but were you ever a professional musician?" She looked at him quietly for a moment. "Why do you ask?" "Because when you play," he said, "it doesn't sound like someone learning, it sounds like someone remembering." Her eyes softened. "I used to play," she said finally. "A long time ago." He waited, sensing there was more. And after a pause, she added, "Life got in the way. I had to stop." There was no sadness in her tone, just acceptance. The teacher nodded slowly, understanding that sometimes stories don't need full explanations. "I'm glad you decided to start again," he said sincerely. When the day of the recital arrived, the small hall at the community center buzzed with excitement. Families filled the seats, cameras flashed, and the scent of flowers mixed with the faint sound of tuning instruments. The students sat in a row near the stage, dressed neatly, some nervously tapping their shoes. Lena sat among them, calm as ever. She wore the same simple dress she always wore, with a small pin on her collar. She wasn't nervous. There was only a quiet stillness in her heart, the kind that comes before something meaningful. When it was finally her turn, she walked up to the piano with quiet confidence. The lights above the stage were soft, the room hushed. She sat down, took a breath, and for a moment time seemed to stop. Then her fingers touched the keys. The music flowed, not just sound but emotion. It was calm, deep, and filled with life. Each note carried a story. Each pause spoke of years lived and moments lost. The audience sat frozen, unable to look away. When the final note faded, the hall remained silent for a few seconds. Then came the applause, loud, warm, heartfelt. Some people even stood up. Lena smiled, bowing gently. She looked out at the faces before her, strangers and friends alike, all touched by something they couldn't quite describe. She didn't need words. The music had spoken for her. After the performance, the teacher met her backstage. "You didn't just play," he said softly. "You made everyone feel." She looked at him, her eyes shining with quiet gratitude. "That's all I ever wanted," she said. That night, as she walked home under the cool night sky, she felt lighter than she had in years. She realized that music wasn't about fame or grand stages or applause. It was about connection, about touching hearts, even in small ways. As she reached her door, she looked up at the stars and whispered, "Thank you for letting me play again." Then she smiled, opened the door, and stepped inside, the sound of her own quiet melody still echoing in her heart. The recital had ended, but the sound of the piano still lingered in everyone's mind. For many who had attended that evening, Lena's performance became the moment they would talk about for weeks. Some described it as peaceful. Some said it felt like a story told through sound. A few even said they felt tears rise up without knowing why. The teacher had been the most surprised of all. After the event, he had replayed that performance in his head again and again. The precision, the emotion, the grace. It wasn't something you could teach in a few months. It was something that came from a lifetime of music. He didn't tell her how deeply it affected him. He only smiled and thanked her for making the recital special. But inside, he knew he had just witnessed something rare. Lena, on the other hand, went back to her quiet routine. She didn't talk about what happened. She didn't look for attention or praise. The next week, she showed up for class as usual, sitting in the same seat in the back row. When people complimented her performance, she simply smiled and said, "I'm glad you liked it." That was all. But something inside her had changed. The recital had opened a small door in her heart, a door she thought she had locked forever. Playing in front of others again reminded her of what it felt like to share music, to see it move people without saying a single word. She didn't realize how much she had missed that feeling until she felt it again. At home, her little keyboard no longer felt enough. Its sound was too thin, too small for what she felt inside. So one afternoon, she visited a nearby second-hand shop that sold old instruments. The shopkeeper was an older man who recognized her from the recital. He smiled as she entered. "Ah, the lady from the concert," he said. "That was some performance. You play beautifully," she smiled shyly. "Thank you," she said. "I'm looking for an old piano. Something not too expensive." He led her to the back of the shop where a few dusty uprights stood against the wall. Most were scratched and worn, but one caught her eye. A dark wooden piano with small carvings along its edges. She pressed a few keys, and though slightly out of tune, the sound was warm and rich. It reminded her of the piano she had once played years ago, back when her life revolved around concert halls and rehearsals. "How much is this one?" she asked. The shopkeeper thought for a moment, then said, "It's been here for a while. I'll give it to you for a fair price if you promise it'll be played again." She smiled. "I promise." It took 2 men and a small truck to bring the piano to her apartment. When they placed it against her wall, the whole space seemed different and fuller, alive. For the first time in years, she sat down at a real piano. When her fingers touched the keys, she felt a wave of warmth rise through her chest. She closed her eyes and began to play softly. The sound filled the room, richer and deeper than anything her old keyboard could make. She played until late that night, losing track of time. The notes flowed like water, carrying pieces of her memories with them. She wasn't practicing. She wasn't performing. She was simply remembering how to breathe through music again. Days passed, and soon her neighbors began to notice. In the evenings, faint melodies drifted through the walls and hallways. Gentle, emotional tunes that seemed to calm whoever heard them. One neighbor, an elderly woman who lived downstairs, once stopped her on the staircase. "I hear your music every night," she said kindly. "It helps me sleep." "It's so beautiful." Lena smiled, slightly embarrassed. "I'm sorry if it's too loud." "Oh no," the woman said quickly. "Don't apologize. Please keep playing. It makes the whole building feel peaceful." That small comment stayed with her. She realized that music had always been her way of connecting, not through words, but through feeling. Even when life had changed, that part of her never disappeared. Meanwhile, at the music center, the teacher had an idea. He wanted to organize a special evening for advanced students and guest performers. The purpose was to inspire the beginners and remind everyone that music had no age or limit. When he mentioned the idea to his colleagues, one of them immediately said, "You should ask that quiet lady, Lena. She's incredible." He nodded. I was thinking the same thing. The next time she came to class, he approached her after the session. "Lena, I wanted to ask if you'd consider performing again. We're hosting a small evening concert next month. Not a formal recital. More of a gathering to celebrate music." She looked surprised. "Me?" "Yes, you," he said, smiling. "Everyone loved your last performance. You have something very special. It would mean a lot if you shared it again." She hesitated for a long moment. "I don't know," she said softly. "I'm not used to that anymore." He nodded, understanding. "Just think about it. No pressure." That night she sat at her piano again, thinking. The idea of performing brought both warmth and fear. She had been away from the stage for so long. The thought of being watched, of being judged, it made her chest tighten. But then she remembered the faces from the recital, the way people had listened in silence, the quiet tears she had seen in some eyes. It wasn't about judgment. It was about connection. A few days later, she told the teacher yes, he was thrilled. "I knew you'd say yes," he said with a grin. "Would you like to choose your own piece?" "I'd like to play something simple," she said again. He laughed gently. "Somehow I don't believe your version of simple." When the day of the concert arrived, the hall was smaller this time, more intimate. The audience included families, students, and a few people from the town who had heard about the event. The air was filled with quiet excitement. When her turn came, Lena walked to the piano calmly. She wore the same simple dress she always wore, her hair neatly tied back. There were no fancy gestures, no dramatic expressions. She just sat down and began to play. This time the piece was different, softer, more hopeful. The notes floated gently like a conversation between her heart and the world around her. The sound filled the room, carrying both sadness and light. The audience listened silently again, completely absorbed. Some closed their eyes. Some smiled faintly, and others simply stared, lost in the beauty of what they were hearing. When she finished, there was a pause, then applause that seemed to go on forever. The teacher stood, clapping the loudest. He wasn't just proud. He was moved. After the concert, several people came to speak to her. A young man said, "I never really liked classical music before, but after hearing you, I think I understand it now." An older woman told her, "Your music reminds me of someone I lost. Thank you." Lena listened to them all with a quiet smile. She didn't know what to say except thank you, but inside her heart was full. That night when she returned home, she sat at her piano again, just as she always did. She played softly, this time not for herself, but for everyone she had touched through her music. For the first time in many years, she felt peace, the kind that comes from finally doing what you were always meant to do. Over the next weeks, word of her performances began to spread around the small town. Some people called the music center to ask if she gave lessons. Others asked when she would play again. The teacher spoke to her one afternoon. "People want to learn from you," he said. "Would you consider teaching a beginner's class?" She looked surprised again. "Me teach?" He smiled. "Yes, you. You have more to give than you realize." She thought about it for a while. Teaching wasn't something she had planned, but the idea warmed her heart. If she could help others find the same peace that music gave her, maybe that was her purpose now. "All right," she said softly. "I'll try." The teacher grinned. That's all anyone can ask for. And so the quiet woman who once sat in the back of the classroom began standing at the front. The students adored her patience, her gentle way of teaching, and her ability to make even the hardest pieces feel possible. She never spoke much about her past, but every time she demonstrated something on the piano, they could all sense the depth of her experience. Through teaching, she found something even more powerful than performing: the joy of watching others discover music for themselves. Sometimes, after class, she stayed behind alone, playing softly as the lights dimmed. The sound of the piano filled the empty room, echoing through the halls like a quiet reminder. No matter how much life changes, the music inside us never truly fades. The months passed quietly after Lena started teaching at the music center. Her class was small, only 6 students at first, but word spread quickly about her kindness and patience. More people began signing up, not just because she was good at teaching, but because she made them feel something deeper, that music wasn't just about notes and timing, it was about emotion, memory, and connection. Every student loved how she never raised her voice, never rushed anyone. When someone made a mistake, she smiled gently and said, "That's all right. Every wrong note teaches you something." Her calm presence made even the shyest learners open up. The teachers at the center noticed how her students progressed faster than others. It wasn't just her technique. It was the way she encouraged them. She told stories about how music could change moods, heal sadness, or remind someone of a person they loved. She spoke softly, but every word came from experience. One afternoon while she was teaching, a middle-aged man stood outside the classroom door listening. He had been watching her lessons for weeks but had never introduced himself. When the class ended, he finally walked in and said, "Excuse me, ma'am. You play beautifully. Would you ever consider performing at our town's cultural night next month? It's a small event, but people from the whole community come." Lena looked surprised. "Oh, I don't know if I'm the right person for that," she said softly. He smiled. "You're exactly the right person. We've heard about your performances at the center. People still talk about them." She hesitated, as she always did when asked to play publicly. Performing had once been her whole life, and then for many years it had been her greatest fear. But she could see the sincerity in the man's eyes, and something inside her whispered that maybe she shouldn't hide anymore. "All right," she said after a long pause. "I'll do it," the man smiled. "Wonderful. We're honored." After he left, Lena sat alone in the classroom for a while, staring at the piano. Her reflection shimmered faintly on its polished surface. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from concert halls to quiet classrooms, from applause to silence, and now slowly back again. When she went home that night, she stood by her window, looking at the city lights. Life had been strange, unpredictable. She had lost so much once, her career, her stage, her confidence, but somehow, life had led her back to music again, step by step, without her even realizing it. Over the next few weeks, she practiced for the event. Her new piano became her closest companion. She spent hours each evening playing softly, experimenting with pieces that spoke to her heart. She wanted something emotional, something that told her story without needing words. Finally, she decided on a composition she had written many years ago, back when she still dreamed of becoming one of the great pianists of her time. It was a piece no one had ever heard, gentle, melancholic, but full of hope. She called it "The Journey Home." When the day of the cultural night arrived, the community center was buzzing with excitement. Families filled the hall, children ran between the seats, and people chatted with anticipation. There were singers, dancers, and local artists, each performing with passion and pride. When it was her turn, the host introduced her simply. "And now, please welcome a special guest, someone whose music has touched many hearts in our town." The crowd clapped politely as Lena walked onto the stage. She wore a plain blue dress, her hair tied back neatly. There was no glitter, no fanfare, just quiet confidence. She sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and closed her eyes for a moment. The hall fell silent. Then she began to play. The first notes floated softly through the air, almost like a whisper. Each sound carried emotion, the sadness of lost years, the peace of acceptance, the beauty of rediscovery. The melody was simple, yet it had a depth that pulled everyone in. As she played, it felt like time slowed down. Every person in the room could feel something personal, something real. A young girl in the front row leaned against her mother's arm, listening. An older man wiped his eyes quietly. Even those who knew nothing about classical music could sense that what they were hearing came from the heart. When the last note faded, there was silence. Then, as if the audience suddenly remembered to breathe, applause erupted, long, loud, and filled with emotion. People stood up, clapping and cheering, calling her name. Lena smiled, her eyes glistening with tears she didn't try to hide. She bowed humbly, then walked off the stage. Backstage, the man who had invited her was waiting, beaming. "That was beautiful," he said. "You didn't just play, and you spoke to everyone in that room." She smiled softly. "I just shared what was already inside me." That night she went home feeling lighter than she had in years. For the first time, she didn't feel like a woman who had lost her dream. She felt like someone who had found a new one. The next few days brought many small but meaningful moments. People stopped her on the street to thank her for the music. Parents asked if she could teach their children. Even strangers smiled when they recognized her. The local newspaper printed a small piece about her, calling her the quiet virtuoso. She laughed when she saw it. She didn't feel like a virtuoso anymore. She felt like a woman who had finally come home to herself. The music center, too, grew busier. The owner decided to expand the number of classes, and Lena was given her own small room to teach in. She decorated it simply, a few plants, a vase with fresh flowers, and photographs of famous pianists she admired. She even hung a framed sheet of her own handwritten composition, The Journey Home, on the wall. Her students grew to love her more each week. She didn't just teach them how to play. She taught them how to feel. "Don't rush," she would say. "Listen to the silence between the notes. That's where the emotion lives." One evening, after class ended, the teacher who had first introduced her to the music center came to visit her room. He watched her close up her books and smiled. "You've changed this place, you know," he said. "Your presence has brought something special here." She smiled gently. "I think this place changed me first." They both laughed quietly. Then after a pause, he asked, "Do you ever think about performing professionally again? Maybe recording something?" Her eyes softened. "I've thought about it," she admitted. "But I'm not chasing stages anymore. I think my time now is meant for something different." He nodded, understanding. "You've already found what many musicians spend their whole lives searching for." "What's that?" she asked. "Peace," he said. His words stayed with her long after he left. She sat down at the piano and played a few gentle notes, smiling to herself. Peace, yes, maybe that's what this new chapter of her life was about. Not proving anything, not seeking applause, but sharing what she loved in her own quiet way. As weeks turned into months, Lena's life found a rhythm again. Mornings filled with music lessons, afternoons spent helping students practice, evenings playing for herself. She became known not just as a teacher, but as someone who reminded others of why music mattered. One night, as she played by her window, she noticed something outside. A small crowd of children standing on the street, listening through the open curtains. Their faces glowed in the light from her apartment. When she saw them, she smiled and waved. Instead of stopping, she kept playing, this time choosing a light, cheerful tune. The children clapped in rhythm, giggling as the notes danced into the night air. For Lena, that simple moment, sharing music with children outside her window, meant more than any standing ovation she had ever received on grand stages. It reminded her that music didn't belong to perfection or fame. It belonged to people, to hearts that listened and felt something real. Later that night, when she closed the piano lid and stood by her window, she whispered softly, "Maybe this was always my real stage." And in that quiet room, surrounded by the echoes of her own melody, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the years that tested her, for the silence that shaped her, and for the music that had never truly left her, only waited until she was ready to play again. The months after Lena's performance at the cultural night were filled with quiet joy. Life seemed softer, lighter. Her days followed a peaceful rhythm, teaching, practicing, and sometimes just sitting by her window, listening to the wind moving through the trees. The world outside felt calm again, and for the first time in many years she felt like she truly belonged somewhere. Her students had grown confident too. They no longer hesitated to try difficult pieces, because they knew that even when they made mistakes, Lena would simply smile and say, "Try again. Music forgives." The classroom often filled with laughter and cheerful piano sounds. There was warmth in that little room, the kind that comes from people doing something they love together. One morning, the school principal walked into her class unexpectedly. He waited until the students finished their practice, then said, "Lena, there's something I'd like to ask." She looked up curiously. "Yes," he smiled. "We're organizing a big year-end recital for all students. It's going to be our biggest event yet. We'd like you to close the evening with one final performance." Her fingers froze slightly above the piano keys. "Me?" "Yes," he said. You've inspired so many people here. It would mean a lot to everyone." She hesitated. A part of her still feared being in the spotlight. For so long she had hidden behind the safety of teaching. But another part of her, the quiet, brave part that had slowly awakened over the past year, whispered that maybe she shouldn't say no. She smiled softly. "All right," she said. "I'll do it." The news spread quickly. Students were thrilled. Some even said they couldn't wait to see their teacher perform again. Every time someone mentioned the recital, Lena felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. She spent the next several weeks choosing the right piece, something that represented how far she and her students had come. After a lot of thought, she decided not to play one of her old classical pieces. Instead, she wrote something new. The music came to her naturally, as if it had been waiting inside her all along. It was gentle at first, then powerful and full of emotion, a blend of her past and present. She named it Second Chance. On the day of the recital, the entire hall glowed with anticipation. Parents, teachers, and students filled the seats. The air was full of chatter and excitement. One by one, students went up on stage, playing, bowing, and smiling proudly as the crowd applauded. Lena sat quietly backstage, watching them with pride. When her turn came, the lights dimmed. The host stepped forward and said, "And now, to close our recital, we have someone very special, the heart of our music program. Please welcome Miss Lena." The audience clapped warmly as she walked out. She took slow, steady steps toward the piano. Her simple blue dress swayed slightly as she moved, and though her heart was beating fast, her face carried calmness. When she sat down and placed her hands on the keys, the room fell completely silent. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. In her mind, she saw flashes of her life, the small apartment where she had first practiced, the years of silence, the dusty music sheets she had hidden away, and the moment she found her courage again. Every memory felt like a note in the song she was about to play. Then she began. The first note rang softly, like a whisper in a quiet room. The melody grew slowly, building with each measure, gentle, then emotional, then rising into something powerful and full of life. Her fingers moved with ease, but her expression showed everything: her joy, her pain, her gratitude. People in the audience leaned forward, drawn in by the honesty of the music. It wasn't about skill anymore. It was about feeling, the kind that touches something deep inside you, the kind that makes you remember moments you thought you'd forgotten. As she played the final part, the tempo slowed, as if she were saying goodbye to an old version of herself. The last note hung in the air, trembling for a moment before fading into silence. For a few seconds, no one moved. The room stayed perfectly still. Then suddenly the audience rose to their feet, clapping and cheering loudly. Some were crying. Her students were shouting her name, their faces full of admiration. Lena smiled shyly, tears shining in her eyes. She stood and bowed. The applause felt like a wave, warm and overwhelming, washing away all the doubts she had carried for years. Afterward, people came to meet her backstage. The principal shook her hand firmly. "That was incredible," he said. "You didn't just play music tonight, you told a story." One of her students ran up and hugged her tightly. "I want to play like you one day," the child said. Lena laughed softly. "You will," she said. "Just keep playing from your heart." When she finally returned home that night, the city was quiet. She made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window again, the same place she always went when she needed to think. The moonlight spilled across her small living room. Touching the piano's polished surface, she sat down, touched the keys lightly, and began to play a slow, peaceful tune, something spontaneous and unplanned. It wasn't for anyone else this time. It was just for her. As she played, she thought about how far she had come, how once she had been afraid to touch the piano again, and now it had become the center of her life once more. She thought about her students, her new friends, and the little moments that had rebuilt her spirit piece by piece. She didn't have grand dreams anymore, no desire for fame or recognition. All she wanted was to keep sharing music in her own quiet way, helping others find their own voices. The following week, she noticed something touching. One of her youngest students brought her a small gift, a folded piece of paper with a drawing of a piano and the words, "Thank you for giving us music." Lena smiled and pinned it on the wall behind her piano. It became her favorite decoration. Soon after, the local radio station reached out, asking if she'd be willing to share one of her compositions for their Sunday arts program. They had heard about her performance from someone who attended the recital. At first she hesitated, but then she agreed. Not for fame, but because she wanted people who had given up on their dreams to know it's never too late. The day her music played on the radio, she sat quietly at home, listening. Hearing her own piece echo through the speakers filled her heart with peace. She didn't cry this time. She just smiled, knowing she had finally found her way back to what she loved. In the following months, her story spread quietly around town. People began referring to her as the woman who made everyone believe in second chances. She never let it get to her head. Whenever someone praised her, she would simply say, "It's not about talent. It's about love. When you love something deeply, it always finds its way back to you." Her life became beautifully simple. Mornings with her students, afternoons filled with melodies, and evenings surrounded by soft light and quiet gratitude. One evening, as she walked home from the center, she passed by a small park where a boy was sitting on a bench trying to play a tiny keyboard. He looked frustrated, his fingers stumbling over the notes. Lena stopped and smiled. "Do you need some help?" she asked gently. The boy looked up a little shy and nodded. She sat beside him and guided his hands patiently. "There," she said. "Now try again, slowly this time." When he played the melody correctly, his face lit up with joy. Lena smiled too, feeling something familiar stir inside her, that same quiet happiness that music had always given her. As she walked away, she could hear the boy still playing behind her, the sound echoing softly through the park. It reminded her of herself many years ago, a girl with big dreams, sitting alone at a piano, not knowing where life would take her. Now, after everything, she understood something important. Music wasn't about stages or applause. It was about moments like this, small, human moments that connected hearts. That night, as she closed her piano at home, she whispered to herself, "Maybe this is what I was meant to do all along, not to be seen, but to help others be heard." And as she turned off the lights and went to bed, a faint melody lingered in the air, soft, warm, and full of life, just like her. The seasons changed, and so did life around the small music center. Children who had once struggled to find the right keys were now confidently playing songs on their own. Parents often peeked through the door, watching with proud smiles as Lena gently guided her students. Her calm voice, her warm smile, and the way she encouraged even the shyest child made her more than a teacher, and she became a source of comfort and inspiration for everyone there. It had been 2 years since she first walked into the center as a quiet woman who just wanted to learn again. Now she was the heart of the place, the reason many new students joined. Her music classes were always full, yet she never seemed tired or impatient. Teaching had become her purpose, her way of giving back to life. One morning, while she was tidying her classroom, the principal came in holding an envelope. "Lena," he said with a small smile, "this came for you." She took it carefully, curious. Inside was an invitation printed on thick paper. The city's main concert hall was organizing an event to honor musicians who had contributed to the community through teaching and performance. At the bottom, her name was written among the invitees. She looked up in surprise. "This must be a mistake," she said softly. "I'm not a performer anymore. I just teach." The principal shook his head. "No mistake. You've touched more lives than you know. That's what this is about, celebrating people like you." She smiled shyly, folding the letter. "I don't know if I belong there," she whispered. He replied gently, "You do. You've earned it." That night she sat by her window again, holding the letter in her hands. The moonlight fell softly on the piano keys beside her. For a long time she didn't move. She thought about her journey, how she had once been a performer on grand stages, how she lost everything, and how life had slowly brought her back to music in a completely different way. Part of her still felt small, undeserving of such recognition. But another part of her, the quiet, brave part that had guided her through everything, said maybe it was time to stop hiding from her own story. The evening of the event arrived. The grand concert hall was filled with people, musicians, teachers, students, and their families. The golden lights shimmered off the instruments arranged on the stage. Lena sat among the invitees, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She wore a soft gray dress, simple yet elegant, and her face carried that familiar peace that everyone loved about her. As speeches began, one after another, people talked about how music had changed their lives, how it had helped them through pain and given them hope. Listening to them, Lena felt tears in her eyes. She knew that same feeling, the way music could heal what words couldn't. When her name was called, she walked slowly to the stage. The host spoke warmly. "Tonight, we honor a woman whose humility and love for music have inspired an entire community. She reminds us that true talent doesn't seek attention, it simply shines." The audience applauded as she accepted her small award. It wasn't about fame or trophies, it was about the journey. She thanked them softly, saying only, "Music gave me a second life. I'm grateful I can share it with others." Her voice trembled, but her smile was steady. After the ceremony, several people came up to her. Some were parents. Others were teachers who had heard about her story. One young woman said, "When I lost my confidence after failing an audition, I heard about you. You made me believe it's okay to start again." Lena touched her hand and said, "It's never too late to begin again. Every song has pauses, and that's what makes it beautiful." That night, as she walked out of the hall, the cool breeze brushed against her face. The city lights glowed like scattered stars. She took a deep breath and smiled to herself. It wasn't applause or attention she carried home. It was peace. The kind that stays quietly in your heart. Weeks later, her students convinced her to record her music. They said they wanted something to remember her by, something to listen to when she wasn't around. She laughed and said, "I'm not going anywhere." But inside, she felt touched by their love. One of her older students, a young man who had been with her since the start, helped her set up a small microphone and laptop. Together, they recorded some of her favorite pieces, simple melodies she had written herself. She played each piece softly, the way she always did, pouring her emotions into every note. When she finished, the student looked amazed. "That was beautiful," he said quietly. "People need to hear this," Lena smiled. "If it makes even one person feel something real, that's enough for me." He later uploaded the recordings online with her permission. Within days, hundreds of people began listening, leaving messages like, "This music calmed my heart," and "It feels like someone understands me." She didn't know most of them, but every message reminded her why she played. Not for attention, but to connect. Months turned into another year. Life continued peacefully. The music center thrived, children grew, and her small world stayed full of sound and laughter. But time, as always, kept moving. Lena began to feel her hands tiring more easily, her steps slowing a bit. One afternoon, she was teaching a young girl a simple melody. The girl stopped suddenly and asked, Miss Lena, how do you make the piano sound like it's talking? Lena smiled gently. Because I don't just play with my fingers, she said. I play with my heart. The child tilted her head, thinking about it. Then maybe that's why it sounds so alive, she said softly. Lena's smile widened. Maybe it is. As the days passed, her students continued to grow more skilled. One of them, a teenage boy, got accepted into a well-known music academy. When he came to tell her, she hugged him warmly. I'm proud of you, she said. Always remember, technique is important, but emotion is everything. He nodded with tears in his eyes. I'll never forget that. That evening, after everyone had gone, Lena stayed in the classroom a bit longer. She sat at the piano and began to play The Journey Home again, the same piece she had performed years ago when she returned to music. The notes filled the empty room, soft and slow, echoing through the quiet halls. When the last note faded, she looked at her hands. They had grown older, but they were still steady. She whispered to herself, You've carried me well. Then she smiled, turned off the light, and went home. From that night on, she began to write down her thoughts in a small notebook. Memories, lessons, little stories about music and life. She wanted her students to have something to hold on to, even when she was no longer there to guide them. The book was never published. She didn't write it for the world. She wrote it for them, the ones who would carry her music forward in their own way. Years later, long after she retired, the Music Center held a special event in her honor. Her former students returned, now adults, some with children of their own. They shared stories about how her lessons had shaped their lives. Some became teachers, some performers, some simply lifelong lovers of music. But all of them said the same thing, that her kindness and her belief in them had changed everything. At the end of the event, one of her oldest students sat at the piano and played Second Chance, the piece Lena had composed for her recital years ago. The melody filled the hall with warmth. People smiled, some wiping away tears. It was as if Lena herself were there again, sitting quietly at the piano, smiling with that same gentle peace. Music has a way of keeping people alive, not just in sound, but in memory, in feeling, in the way it lingers long after the last note. And so, her story didn't end with silence. It continued through every child who pressed a key for the first time, every student who believed they could learn, every listener who found comfort in her melodies. The simple woman the teachers once underestimated had left behind something greater than applause. She had left behind a legacy of kindness, hope, and music that would never fade. And somewhere, in the quiet of the night, when the wind moved gently through the trees and a distant piano played softly, it almost felt like she was still there, smiling, listening, and whispering through every note. Keep playing, always.